heartwarming story. How did it feel? So, Steve, is that the first time you've seen it?
No, I was sent a link just after it was made, before it was edited completely. I was sent a link and I was able to watch it through the first time with just my wife.
This must have been a surreal journey for you, from sort of thinking that this was just sort of buried in the past, and at times sort of worrying to sort of think, okay, well, where is this going? Where's this going to end up?
It was a bit worrying, to be honest, because I think I tried to explain myself in the film that my biggest concern was dragging my family name on behalf of Dad through what something isn't too clever to do, really. So I was just a little bit concerned, and it went from an innocent conversation in an ambulance with Andy to sat here now.
When did you realise it wasn't really going to go away? That you might have to sort of in a way confront what happened?
The first time really was when Nick contacted me on the telephone. I was on holiday in Spain and he rang up and explained in the film, and he just sort of said, "We think we know a little bit more about it than you're letting on." So okay. He said, "We've got some investigative journalists working on our behalf, and they've identified your surname on the electoral register for 100 Cambridge Gardens." So that was when I thought, well, whatever I say now isn't going to sound authentic or real. I'm just going to be made to look silly. So I just said, well, yeah, good for Dad, if that makes it.
Did you have to talk it over with anyone? Did you sort of?
No, not really. I didn't have to talk it over with anyone. I didn't. Initially, when I spoke to Nick, it was just they found this guitar. So that was the story. That was it. So I just explained how it had gone through our family. I didn't envisage this film, the documentary, the newspaper reports and things like that going on. So I didn't think I'd have to explain anything. I didn't think it would be anything that my family would be recognise or see or even come across really. So it wasn't going to be as aired as it has been. So I didn't, at the time, I didn't think I had to speak to anyone. No.
Catherine, and I guess Arthur as well, when did you realise that you had a film on your hands? You had this was unfolding in a very in a narrative arc that must have been very pleasing to sort of flesh out.
Yeah, I think to start with, I mean, there was the amazing roadmap that we had from Naomi and Scott and Nick in terms of the investigation and the hunt and the characters involved in that. I think I probably speak for both of us when we started, we were aware that it was a 6-decade story, so there was also an element that felt mildly overwhelming, I think, in terms of how you cover that in a film whilst telling this incredible hunt story that we had. But the base was a real gift in many ways, in that it just so happened that it dropped into really wonderful parts of Paul's story as well. So you had pre-Beatlemania, and then you had the early 70s and Wings, and him kind of coming back to terms with his music from the Beatles era and going forward from there. So these lovely, still, I guess, coexisting timelines that were going on.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the base is a McGuffin in a way. It has value, but it's not so much the instrument itself, which
maybe explain what a McGuffin.
Well, a McGuffin is a sort of an object, a device that is in itself not of great value, but it's attached to value. And I think it's a way through a story, and the object, which Paul bought for £30 in Hamburg, has enormous value because of its connection to him, and because of its connection to a pre-Beatlemania Paul, an 18-year-old Paul, who was still finding his way in the world, with this bass in his hands. And it's taken on even more value now because it brings people like Steve and Scott and Naomi and Nick and Ian Horn and all these other people into the story.
Yeah.
So that was the sort of big gift in a way. I think there's been so so much said about the Beatles, so much written, so many films made, but it's lovely to be able to make a film that places, you know, for lack of a better word, sort of normal people alongside Paul. I think one of the great joys is having Paul sit in this film alongside Steve and Andy and Scott and Naomi, and for all of them to have, you know, the same right to be part of the same story.
And we'll come to the getting of Paul, the participation of Paul in this film shortly. But I just wanted to turn to you, Naomi, and you know, it just occurred to me earlier on that obviously, you know, you and Scott were investigative journalists. Watching television with you guys must be very different to watching television with most other people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I'd say about watching this film is that Arthur and Catherine have done the most incredible job of bringing our investigation search to life, but also the significance of the base as well. And one of the things that I discovered when we were looking for it was how much it means to people like Ian, who've been looking, searching for it for over 50 years, or, you know, actually how much it means to you as well, Steve.
So take me back to that, you know, reading and watching Glastonbury, the club, you know, and so was it Scott first of all that sort of had that initial sort of curiosity? I mean, is this how it is at home with you guys all the time? If someone just spots something, I wonder if there's a story behind that.
Well, interestingly, we might be starting to look for other lost objects of cultural significance as well. Yeah.
On the back of this?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Fantastic. Okay, let's turn to, so you've got this incredible story, and you know, obviously it would be amazing to sort of have the participation of Paul. How do you get that ball rolling along?
Gosh, I mean, that sort of predates me coming onto it, because I think it was from Naomi and Scott and Nick. They had built this relationship, they'd returned the base, and I think there was a conversation
Exactly.
about possibly making a film about
Yeah,
it.
so we've developed a relationship and spoken particularly to Paul's nephew, who's his lawyer as well, and they had said that they would support us with any documentary that we wanted to make.
And I guess that means that suddenly it means you can use the music, right?
Yeah, so that's been, so what happened, we came on and there was a sort of, some filming had been done, so Arthur had filmed the bass being returned in the studio, and then the O2 concert, which was amazing, so we had this lovely end to the film by the time I came onto it. But then everything from there forward, I would say there was a sort of ongoing relationship that was built with MPL, which is Paul's company.
Yeah.
And they have been just extraordinarily supportive and brilliant throughout the whole thing. But it was a sort of hold your nerve thing, I would say, with the music. There was a sort of, Arthur and I felt very ambitious from the beginning, and I think early conversations were like, oh, could we maybe do 4 songs, do we think? And so we had Gary Welch, who was amazing but he advised brilliantly, and again, MPL were just amazing in terms of the relationship with the trust, and I think a lot of it came down to the trust and then loving the film at the end. And so we just kept sort of squeezing more Beatles tracks in and hoping that we'd come good by the end.
So Arthur, you were there at the moment of the handover then, of the bass?
Yeah, I was there to see it being restored, and then we got this window of opportunity to film Paul taking possession of it for the first time again, and playing on it for the first time. And what's lovely about that scene watching it back is that the first recognisable Beatles bass line to come out of that bass once he got it back in his hands is the bass line from Day Tripper.
Yes.
And then I find myself a few months later with lovely Andy, Steve's friend, and I hope you won't mind me saying, but there he is sort of slightly mangling Day Tripper. So it got better once you plug it into an amp.
It's only here, by the way.
Andy is here. There he is. There he is. The first time Andy's seen it tonight, so yeah. I hope it was all right.
Andy, yeah, well, you were right to a book, because Andy's a very important part of this story, because you know, you sort of spotted, well, you mentioned it to Steve, and it kind of rapidly evolved from there. It's so many incredible. Another thing I love about this, going back to you, Steve, is there's this social history dimension to it as well, and it does take us back to this age. I was slightly reminded of what that kind of feeling I had watching Life on Mars whenever that was on, about 15 years ago. It's just an age where, for better or for worse, things were done differently, and there was the guy in the pub landlord had this sort of was more than a pub landlord, should we say? Must have been very evocative watching it back and seeing some of those, some of the reconstructions, of that era just developed.
Yeah, it's like I said in there. You could go into the pub, the local pub. It's called locally it's known as the Cow Shed. Its actual name is the Apple Black, but it was known locally as the Cow Shed. And people would just go in there. It would be everyone would go in there locally, and there would just be topics of conversation from sport to local news to who got beat up the night before and who got whacked at the end of the glass, and then it's just you could go in there and buy a puppy, or you could go in there and buy a box of fruit. There was just anything and everything there, and so it was just it was fun. Actually, it was good fun compared to where we are now in this day and age. Back then, it was just fun.
It's that whole culture of knowing a bloke who can, I remember my dad who ran a fish and chip shop, and that was similar to being a pub landlord. He proudly pointed at his feet and said, I've never had to go to a shoe shop to buy a pair of feet. I still don't know exactly what he meant by that. And I don't think I want to know either. So did you get a lot of time with Paul?
Paul's incredibly generous. He's quite a busy guy still. He's about to turn 84, but he's just played a couple of gigs in LA. He's just released a new album. So he was incredibly generous to let us film with him 4 times if you include a little FaceTime into the potting shed in the garden when it was being restored. But no, he was incredibly generous with his time, and I think tickled by the story, very supportive of the story from the start, which is why when we talk about, how much Beatles music we were able to get in there, I think that MPL, and many of them here tonight, were incredibly generous because they knew, how much Paul liked the story, was keen for the story to get out. So yeah, we filmed with him twice, playing it again for the first time. It was another time when they were first taking the bass apart, and then we got to sit down with him, in July last year.
Whose idea was it to come up with the caption "Guitartisan"?
It was actually Martin Harrison, the Guitartisan himself. He's self-titled Guitartisan. Yeah, I love it.
Very good, very, very good. Lovely to see Klaus Forman in there as well, really evoking those early days of Hamburg, and just this charm. The charm of these 4 guys from Liverpool just kind of parachuted into your hometown. He was very obliging, wasn't he, with the drawings and even getting into bed and acting.
I'm not sure if he knew what he was doing at that stage. He was just doing what he was asked to do. But Klaus is incredible. I mean, he's 88 and plays tennis every morning. I think he had his little finger chopped off just after we filmed, but that's no bother for Klaus. And still working incredibly hard, living south of Munich by a lovely lake. And no, he's amazing. He's a whole film in himself, really. He was in Manfred Mann, and he played bass as a session bass player on Lennon's solo albums and on George Harrison's. And I loved his Revolver album cover. And I think it was a conversation from very early on about whether we could incorporate his drawings. And given that he was there when Paul first bought the bass, he was more than happy to oblige. Some of his drawings are outside, so if you haven't looked at them up close, have a little look. Wow. 3 of the original drawings are outside, and then prints of a few more.
Have those been lent to you?
I'm just going to forget to give them back.
Well, yeah, and then there'll be a documentary made about it. Naomi, how many leads did you pursue before realising that, the gentleman to your right might be?
Well, I think to start off with, Nick had some leads that looked like they could, that they were good. And so I think probably for about a month or so they were pursued. And then we had all these weird and wonderful 600 emails, one saying that it was at Mar-a-Lago and Japan, all over.
Was there any context given to the Mar-a-Lago claim? Was it from the president himself? He lies about everything else, so why didn't he lie about that?
But it was that email from Ian that set this whole sort of snowball in place of they've found sort of a lead after that. So it was Ian that set was really important.
Yeah. Wow. Steve, was it? It must have been important to hear Paul say about your dad that he doesn't blame him too much.
Yeah, I mean, it was nice. Obviously, I've had the opportunity to speak to McCartney himself, but it was nice to hear on the film that he, doesn't hold any grudges as such, because it must have been, as he said, if you have something nicked, you want it back, and it must have been, quite a nice feeling to have his guitar back. I would have thought.
I should say, Steve sort of underplays how brave he was to sort of come forward, and the film doesn't exist without Steve coming forward. And I think that we'd already had conversations with Paul where we knew that Paul felt zero ill will. In fact, I think he's probably pleased that the bass was stolen and had the journey it's had, because he loves a good story, and he didn't miss it much at first. But it took time with Steve to persuade him that, understandably, that nobody was going to see George as the bad guy in all of this, which he really isn't. And it's very exposing for Steve to have taken part in this. But
Of course, I think everyone's very grateful.
he's sort of the glue, really, the key to the whole thing.
I know I think he had a train to catch, but we've also got Ian Horn in the house, who's in the film, very important part of the film, Paul's roadie and sound engineer, who wishes he hadn't parked the car in, was it Pembridge Gardens?
Cambridge Gardens in Ladbroke Road.
So a round of applause for Ian as well. One thing I also sort of found fascinating is this sort of the guitar as a sort of metric of interest in the Beatles story at different points in time. So, we had around the time it was stolen, Paul sort of fairly casual reaction, which is, I don't work on them. And then, because that was sort of the decade where he was trying to put the Beatles behind him. That's a sort of interesting thing, isn't it? How its kind of share index almost has sort of gone up and down. Was that a useful kind of thing to hold on to when telling the story?
Yeah, I think that it was, like I say, because it was covering 6 decades, and so there was this amazing gift that you could trace Paul and the Beatles and their sort of how they've been perceived through history and at the time, and again that sort of moment with Elvis, when it comes back and he kind of comes to terms again with his past music and performing it again. So it did feel like a real gift, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of symbol of the enduring affection that everyone has for Beatles, that even when Paul wanted to sort of leave it behind for a while.
It's great that you've got Elvis Costello there, who is sort of the kind of, when the trip switch goes from this thing, like even Paul sort of not really sort of wondering what relevance he has to who he was prior to his work with, and then Elvis saying, well no, and then that's kind of the dominoes topple onto the present day. That was absolutely sort of incredible.
Yeah, we were very lucky to get Elvis, and I think that I've been told he was an amazing interviewee, but also he's just so passionate about their music, and you know, he had that connection as well from when he was a child. So there's that amazing thing with them, I think, almost, which surprised me, almost everyone that we filmed with had these very formative memories of the Beatles and their music, you know, whether it was Elvis or Graham or, you know, whoever it was, you talk to them about those early days of hearing the songs for the first time.
Yeah.
It was such a huge thing for people. So it was lovely to be able to kind of tap into that, I think, but then for Elvis to also be a really key part of the Beatle base and, you know, bringing it back was lovely.
We've got time for one more question, and it's a fairly trivial one, but I'm raging with curiosity. What was that completely empty room that you put Paul in, with having literally nothing else in it?
That was
Almost looked like a hostage situation.
was the building. It's the building next door to One Soho Square, which is where MPL have been established for a long time. And at that time, it was empty and awaiting new occupants. So we got the choice of a few rooms and chose that one.
Highly convenient. Okay, I'm going to try and get this in the right order, but thank you very much, all of you, Steve, Catherine, Arthur, Naomi, and Ian, of course, and Andy. Thank you all for your very, very significant part in making this such a heartwarming. While you're married, it's still the day story in the whole, right? Thank you very much. Thanks all for coming, and good best of luck with it. I eagerly await to see what your next investigations yield.